Good morning, and thank you for joining us for another program in our series. I'm Rebecca Belding, a historian at our museum, and I'm hosting today's show. 5 years ago this week, white supremacists brazenly marched through the college town of Charlottesville, Virginia, carrying flaming torches and chanting racist and anti-Jewish slogans. That weekend's Unite the Right rally turned deadly when one peaceful counter-protester, Heather Heyer, was killed, and many others were injured. Self-proclaimed neo-Nazis, some of whom participated in the rally, have drawn new recruits with the viral spread of conspiracy theories that stoke division. Today, I'm joined by two guests to help us understand the history of these symbols, myths, and conspiracies, and to learn how beliefs that once seemed fringe are fueling more visible hatred and violence today. If you've watched our programs before, you may recognize our first guest, Dr. Edna Friedberg, the regular program host and a historian at our museum. Edna has extensively studied and written about the Holocaust-era roots of the violent events in Charlottesville. Thank you for trading places with me today and for sharing your expertise with the audience. Good morning, Edna.
Good morning, Becky. Good to see you.
Nice to see you. I would also like to welcome David E. Mills, a partner at the law firm Cooley LLP. David was part of a team of lawyers who sued the planners of the Unite the Right rally, with Cooley donating its services pro bono on behalf of those who were injured in Charlottesville. The 2021 verdict found that the organizers of the rally were indeed part of a violent and racially motivated conspiracy. David, thank you for bringing such a unique perspective to our conversation. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So, Edna, let's begin with you. The racist and anti-Jewish violence on display in Charlottesville shocked many of us. It became a defining moment, showcasing the mainstreaming of white supremacy in America. And so my first question is really a personal and a professional one. As a Holocaust historian, as a daughter of a Holocaust survivor, what were you thinking and feeling at that time watching this?
Personally, I was feeling a lot of disgust. It was very, very distressing. As you mentioned, my father was a Holocaust survivor. My grandparents were survivors. But even more than that, just the setting of Charlottesville, University of Virginia, for people who've not been there, is situated in Charlottesville. And I grew up in a college town, a large state university, very much like Charlottesville, with a small, tight-knit Jewish community. My dad was a professor there. And so I could kind of picture that scene and how it's usually a really tranquil place with a lot of diversity. And then when I heard on the news that on the Jewish Sabbath on Shabbat, the rabbi and congregants had to slip out a back door, taking with them their Torah scrolls, including one that had been salvaged from a destroyed Jewish community during the Holocaust, that they had to take it out for safekeeping. It was terrifying. And I just was actually so relieved that my dad didn't live to see that day when people would be so brazen. But on a professional level, obviously, I looked at it through some different eyes and saw many echoes of the history that I study every day. Many of the symbols, the chants, the use of torches for marching through the city were deliberately chosen to be copycats, to try to mimic what the Nazis had done in the 1930s. And then finally, there was the extra resonance and the extra hateful resonance of doing this in the American South, where fire reminds us of nights of firebombs and lynchings, events that were designed to direct terror at Black residents of the American South. So there were all these different layers that added up to a very, very disturbing weekend.
Well, let's take a second to remind our audience of some of the things that Edna just described, what the scene looked like in Charlottesville 5 years ago tonight. You have probably already seen this footage before, but just as a warning, it is really upsetting.
Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us! I'm one of you! White lives matter! White lives matter! White lives matter! White lives matter!
I always have to kind of stop and take a breath after watching stuff like that. David, I turn to you now. So Unite the Right represented a rare collaboration among these white supremacist groups. What were they trying to accomplish with their rally, and why did they choose Charlottesville?
Yeah, I've seen that clip many times, and it still takes my breath away as well. This really was an extremely unusual alliance of white supremacist groups that gathered in Charlottesville, ostensibly to protest the removal of a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee from a city park. But as we learned over the course of time, their true purpose was to galvanize their movement through a weekend of confrontations, violence that would send their message more widely and keep moving forward with their goal of normalizing violence and hate speech. Two of the people who organized the Unite the Right weekend were also University of Virginia alumni. So they knew the campus very well, and they saw this as an opportunity to use the city's progressive decision to remove that statue as an opportunity to turn Charlottesville into a battleground for their own purposes, really. The permitted rally that they had set up for that weekend was scheduled for Saturday at noon, but the organizers actually choreographed a nighttime torchlight march on Friday night without a permit. And as Edna described, that torch march deliberately echoed the pageantry of events one might have seen in Nazi Germany in the 1930s. And that night, to maximize the terror effect, rather than walk along a public road to their destination, they took this small army of people, which was 300-400 mostly white men with torches lit, chanting extremely loudly on an indirect route before leading through the heart of the campus at the University of Virginia. One of the witnesses at our trial, Diane DaCosta, is a fourth-year student at UVA. She's Black and Jewish, and she testified about being trapped in her room that night with only one door that opened up to where the Nazis were marching and chanting. They were so loud, she could hear their chants of Jews will not replace us, and blood and soil, which is another common Nazi slogan from the 1930s. She heard that several minutes before they even arrived in front of her room, and she was so fearful for her life that she hid a necklace that she wore that had a Jewish symbol on it, because she was afraid that some of the Nazis would come into her bedroom. The march ended at a statue of Thomas Jefferson, the third president and himself a slaveholder, where about 20 counter-protesters who had heard about this event, they held hands in a circle to protect the campus. But 300 or 400 white supremacists attacking them with their fists and torches. One of their leaders, Richard Spencer, a prominent white nationalist who speaks quite frequently, he claimed victory at that time, just before the law enforcement cleared the area. Several of those counter-protesters who were there surrounding the statue were injured. Two of them ended up as plaintiffs in our case.
I remember just watching it on television and being absolutely horrified. I can't imagine how terrifying it must have been to be there, to be one of the counter-protesters, to be Diane in her room. I want to take a second and thank everyone who is joining us today. Thank you for joining us from Canton, New York. I think that's probably one of the teachers that we work with, who's always up there in Canton watching us, from Shreveport, Louisiana, Houston, Texas, Seattle, Washington, and welcome to our international viewers. We're hearing from people in Argentina, in Colombia, and in Canada. Welcome, everyone. So the nighttime spectacle on campus, though, was not the only horrifying moment that weekend. David, as you said, there was a permitted rally the next day, and that was meant to be the main event, a large-scale protest in a city park. After the racist display on campus Friday evening and confrontations with counter-protesters, white supremacists converged on the park in riot gear on Saturday. They charged at counter-protesters using flagpoles and shields. The Virginia governor declared a state of emergency before the Unite the Right rally officially began, and police tried to clear the park, but as we know, that did not stop the violence. In downtown Charlottesville, James Fields, who was a foot soldier in the movement, used his car as a weapon, mowing down the crowd, killing peaceful counter-protester Heather Heyer and injuring many others. So we have just shown a lot of images of what that day looked like. We watched the film. Edna, I want to step back and ask you if you can explain the origins of some of the symbols that were chosen by the Charlottesville planners.
Sure. These planners were deliberately mimicking sort of stylistic things that the Nazis did, their drama, they were not particularly original. If we remember anything from that night and from that weekend, it's probably the torches, the tiki torches that they were marching with. And it's really difficult to overstate the centrality of fire and flame to the Nazi regime as a prop that they used. They used it in many parades, in party rallies, including the festivities when Hitler was named Chancellor of Germany. And we're seeing a compilation here of historical footage from several Nazi events in the 1930s, in which we can see how the fire has a sort of hypnotic quality to it. I would encourage our viewers to put yourself into the mindset, into the eyes of a Jew in Germany watching this kind of event in the community. You get the sense that the ideology is spreading literally unstoppably, almost like flames. But it's much more than the fire. The coordinators of the Unite the Right rally also deliberately borrowed over and over again from the myth of so-called Aryan heritage that was so prevalent in Nazi propaganda. We see here a poster. This is not from the Nazi era. This is from 5 years ago to promote the Charlottesville gathering, shared by a group named Vanguard America. And anyone who has ever seen Nazi posters will be struck by how similar the aesthetic is, as in this historic image. Idealized, young, white Germans, healthy, athletic, supposedly pure, and they were intentionally copying that style.
So I know, Edna, that there was a lot of familiar Nazi imagery in some of the posters promoting the event. You just showed one, but there's one in particular that I'm hoping that you can help us decode.
So this is a promotional poster, again, designed to recruit people, and it speaks to who the audience is for this event, that the planners are sending out direct kind of coded messages or dog whistles, if you will, to speak to people who will recognize what they're looking at. So for example, the location of the rally on Saturday, it's intentional that they call it Lee Park. As David had mentioned earlier, the city council had just renamed the park rather than having it named as an homage to Confederate General Robert E. Lee. They had changed the name to Emancipation Park to commemorate the ending of slavery in the United States in the 1860s. So they're deliberately rejecting that and calling it by its old name. But graphically, the eagles that you see towards the center are meant to recall the German imperial eagle. Even the color palette with the bold red and the white and the contrast deliberately echoes the color palette that were used in Nazi posters. And at the bottom are various emblems, including Confederate statues, and then what looks like an army of people marching. So this has a lot of things going on in one poster, all of which are supposed to appeal to people who glorify and admire the Nazis.
So David, Edna mentioned the army at the bottom. This poster is an invitation to join this army, to be part of something that to the audience of this poster was something that seemed important. How did the poster come up in your trial?
Well, we know that this poster in particular was influential to James Fields, the fellow who drove his car into the crowd of peaceful counter-protesters. During the trial, we introduced this into evidence. This was he retweeted this poster on his own Twitter account. So he did his part to essentially recruit more what we've been calling foot soldiers to the cause. You know, Fields drove his car overnight from his home in Ohio to participate in this weekend. He didn't get there in time for the Friday night torch march, but he was texting his mother the whole time, and he had received photos of what that march looked like on Friday night, and he texted those photos to his mother, proclaiming his pride in the movement and associating himself with the other people who were there and participating and carrying torches. He did join in time for the Saturday event, and he marched in uniform with Vanguard America.
So just to remind our viewers, James Fields is the white supremacist who murdered Heather Heyer.
Right.
So it seems, David, like the organizers are kind of faced with a challenge because they want to instigate violence on one hand, and on the other hand, they're using and going to great lengths to disguise those aims. They're using this kind of code that Edna was talking about. I'm wondering what you can tell us, since you were part of discovery, you were part of the trial. What did you learn when you got into their behind-the-scenes communications?
Well, there was a lot of work by a large team of lawyers from 3 different firms that helped put this together. And we got access to a social media and gaming platform called Discord. The planners of the Unite the Right weekend set up invitation-only channels on Discord, and they used those channels to plan the Unite the Right weekend. That's where we found conversations among the organizers that they, of course, at the time, thought would be maintained in confidence and secrecy. But they communicated amongst themselves and with ordinary participants. And over that channel, they provided information, arranged transportation. They even set the dress code. The dress that they, at least for some of the groups that were attending, that they chose was khakis and a white polo shirt, which you might think of as clothing worn by, plenty of American men. But in this case, when it's worn by dozens of men marching in military uniform, with leaders shouting military orders and marchers chanting and carrying banners and shields, they appeared deliberately and acted as like a quasi-military force. James Fields wore this same uniform during the morning on Saturday, which means he did get the message about the uniform. And he was given a shield by the white supremacist group Vanguard America, which is the group he marched with that day. And, you talk about the duplicity. Among other communications that we found on Discord, organizers sent out the word to participants not to bring obvious Nazi or Klan symbols like swastikas, specifically to avoid alienating the general public. Instead, they had their participants bring things like flagpoles, shields, pepper spray that could be used as weapons in violent confrontations, but while maintaining the ability to later claim that they were only meant for self-defense. They planned in advance to trigger counter-protesters into violent confrontations and then overwhelm them with greater force so that the protesters could claim self-defense but actually engage in the violence that they wanted. This technique of baiting or triggering by the white supremacists was the subject of expert testimony that our team introduced at the trial. Another term with historical roots that organizers and participants bragged about was gassing the Jews. This referred, at least in this situation, this referred to using tear gas, actually pepper spray, on Jewish counter-protesters, which we saw a lot of that weekend.
We have a comment in here from Mona, who's watching from Hunterdon County in New Jersey, who says that her son-in-law was at the rally in Charlottesville and leapt onto the sidewalk as he heard and saw presumably James Fields' car roaring down the alleyway, and thank goodness he was safe. And obviously, Mona, we share in our gratitude that your son-in-law was safe. It was such a brave thing for him to be down there, and really terrifying and dangerous for the people who were counter-protesting. Edna, earlier we saw the footage of the white supremacists gathered on the UVA campus. We heard them chant, "Jews will not replace us," which is a phrase I don't like saying out loud. But so that language is clearly very anti-Semitic, but the "replace us" part also relates to a very long-standing conspiracy theory that might be a little less familiar to many people. Can you explain the replacement theory?
Yeah, so as David said, and I don't want to gloss over that last photo we just had where they were talking about gassing the Jews. Many of the marchers in Charlottesville had genocide on their minds, but the one that they were worried about is ostensibly the genocide of themselves. This so-called replacement theory, some racists also call it white genocide, and it's some kind of bizarre idea that white Christians, not only in the US, but also in Europe, are at risk of being outnumbered by non-Christian people, by people with brown skin, and that they will be eventually wiped out because of some kind of demographic battle against them. We can see this theory, the replacement idea, clearly articulated in another poster for the Unite the Right rally. Again, with the Aryan aesthetic that we discussed earlier. On the left is "You will not replace us." But there's a call to action saying this rally is a pivotal moment for the pro-white movement in America. So making people feel that there's an urgency for it and that they are at risk. The replacement theory is fairly recent in that wording, actually comes from France in the last 10, 12 years, but it combines much older forms of hatred, of anti-Semitism and other forms of racism. Within the replacement theory, Jews are somehow pulling the strings of Black Americans and also of immigrants who, in their thinking, then threaten the white race by outnumbering them and in that way replacing him. But the theory also, again, has roots in history. The Nazis consistently portrayed Jewish people as a threat who were scheming and manipulative and wanted to undermine Germany, and that they had powers. We have many, many items in the museum's collections that illustrate this nasty portrayal of Jews. One that we can show now comes from 1941 Yugoslavia, which was German occupied, but that's why it's written in the Cyrillic alphabet. And here we see a Jewish puppet master, quite literally pulling the strings of Stalin and Churchill, the Soviet and British heads of state who were allies in the war against Nazi Germany. I want to be clear, though, that replacement theory, that's kind of innocuous sounding language, but it's much more than a theory. It can have deadly consequences and unfortunately has spurred people to commit violent acts, including just a few months ago, here in May, where in Buffalo, New York, an 18-year-old young man is charged now with murdering 10 people at a grocery store. Investigators have found that this alleged killer targeted this particular community in this particular spot because he wanted to murder as many Black people as possible. And in content that he had posted online, he quoted a call to action, which is very popular among white supremacists on all different platforms. It's known as the 14 words. And I quote it with some reluctance, but it says, "We must ensure the existence of our people and a future for white children." And this is a through line that we see in many, many white supremacist chat rooms and social media. These kind of racist slogans show that there's this twisted idea motivating and feeding deadly violence. And again, it's the kind of code words that signal to like-minded people, hey, I'm one of you, and we are engaged in this battle together.
I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit more about the history of this theory, because you mentioned that the actual phrase, the Great Replacement Theory, comes from France, but that's not where the ideas, as you mentioned, the ideas are much older than that. Like so many modern white supremacist conspiracies, the replacement theory has these historical roots that go on much longer. And I know from my research that there were Americans who bought into this in the early part of the 20th century. Can you please tell us about one of these Americans whose writings caught Adolf Hitler's attention even before he became the leader of Germany?
Yeah, I mean, lest Americans feel too comfortable here and like we're just drawing on some kind of horrible racist import from Germany, there was plenty of cross-pollination across the Atlantic during the 20th century of these kind of white supremacist ideas. Madison Grant was a person who did other things other than hateful things. He was an American conservationist who was central to the creation of the Bronx Zoo in New York. And he moved in prominent social circles, kind of the same circles as President Teddy Roosevelt. But his concerns on a biological basis about invasive species in the natural world were closely tied to his views about human beings as well. Madison Grant believed that the United States, the white United States that he valued, was being polluted both by Black people and by certain types of immigrants. For his mind, particularly European Jews were a toxin that was invading our society. Grant supported forced sterilization, and he lobbied very actively for immigration restrictions that would somehow preserve the dominance of what he and his comrades called the Nordic race. He was an official of a group called the Immigration Restriction League, and they were among many who lobbied for a law or a bill that eventually became a law in 1924 that made it much, much more difficult for people to enter the U.S. It set quotas on the basis of national origin. This is germane to our history because that law was still in effect in the 1930s when Jews were desperately trying to flee Nazi persecution in Europe, and it made it almost impossible for them to find safe haven in the U.S. One last thing I want to say about Madison Grant is we know for a fact that Hitler and other Nazis were aware of him. and saw him as a like-minded person. Grant's book, The Passing of the Great Race, originally published in 1916, was later found in Hitler's personal library. And this is actually the copy, the German language edition, that was in Hitler's library. This particular book is now held at the Library of Congress in Washington.
Yeah, I like what you said earlier about this cross-pollination. I want to make it clear that Hitler's not being inspired by Madison Grant. They are drinking from the same kind of hateful well that is happening both in the United States and in Europe. These hateful ideas of trying to make race science a thing, trying to prove that some races are biologically better than others, and that is still the same thread that inspires white supremacists today. We have a message from a viewer named Jeannie who says, I find it more and more difficult each day to tolerate such horrific beliefs. We must teach the opposite. Our children must learn about our past to form a decent future. We totally agree with you, Jeannie, and hope and are glad to see that you're turning to programs like these to learn more about our past. David, I want to bring you back into the conversation. We have another message from a viewer named Barbara, who wrote, young Nazis on parade mimicking Hitler and his followers, chanting anti-Semitic slogans. Where were they groomed with all this hate? So that's a great question. And I know that there is a witness in your trial, a former white supremacist, who testified about how she and members of her group recruited new members by trying to present this kind of innocent, clean-cut image to society that you alluded about a little bit earlier. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit more about her.
Sure. Samantha Froelich is her name. And one of my colleagues took her deposition and was able to play it at the trial. She had joined the now defunct far-right extremist group Identity Europa in December of 2016. She initially joined because her boyfriend was a member and she wanted to impress him. She said she saw it as an opportunity to learn about her European heritage, which was how the organization actually presented itself to the general public. Within a few months, she was given a formal job to recruit new members, became the women's coordinator and membership coordinator. And in this role, she actually screened hundreds of potential new members. Her job was to weed out, believe it or not, to weed out anyone who looked like a stereotypical neo-Nazi who might ruin their straight-laced public image.
So let's listen for a second to Froelich describe what members of Identity Europa were instructed to do to be accepted by society and to appeal to potential new members.
I mean, optics were paramount to, i.e., getting their message and branding out. Again, make sure that when you're interviewing someone, make sure that the room they're in looks clean. Make sure that they're, they look like they take care of themselves. If you're out in public or in a rally, speak with eloquence. Don't use racial slurs in public. Don't say any Nazi rhetoric in public. Wear slacks and loafers. Wear dresses. Look feminine. Don't use unnatural hair colors. It was very strict. They wanted to look presentable. I would say it was like being wolves in sheep's clothing.
So it seems like they're recruiting with this false front. But once you're in, there's this in-group code that members understand. So kind of like the poster that we looked at earlier, there are symbols and signs that if you were in this group, if you were inculcated with white supremacist imagery, you would recognize these symbols for what they were, but it might seem innocent to the outside world. Edna, I'm hoping that you can explain some of these lesser known symbols, the ones that might not be as readily recognizable in the mainstream as explicit Nazi related visuals.
Sure, let's pull back some of the camouflage here. One of the symbols embraced by today's white supremacists and seen as a more palatable alternative to the swastika, which really doesn't have a lot of currency in our society, to say the least. One of the symbols that they use instead is called the Sonnenrad. It's originally a Norse or Celtic symbol. We can see it here on display in Charlottesville on a large flag, in this case from a Texas-based white supremacist group. During the Nazi era, the black sun wheel, which is another one of its names, was one of the symbols adopted by the SS. And we're seeing here photos from a place in Germany called Wewelsburg Castle, which was a location commandeered by Heinrich Himmler, who headed the elite Nazi Guard. The sun wheel appears here at the center of the tile floor. You can see that graphically, it even reminds me at least a little bit of the swastika in that it kind of has this forward motion and the angles. But Himmler and many other Nazis were deeply interested in Norse mythology, and they used its symbols to help legitimize the Nazis' false claims to some kind of ancient Aryan past. Using these lesser known symbols, again, is a way of making communication more palatable to the general public, but as it also has the added advantage of seeming like some kind of secret communication with followers who, if they recognize it, it's like a wink and a nod. We know what's really going on here, and we're in this secret society, and we are together in its language.
Yeah. We have a comment from Tony, kind of echoing back to a little bit earlier and reinforcing what we were talking about earlier in the program. Tony describes himself as a former white supremacist, and he now works to deprogram others who have also left the movement. And he said that we were exactly right, that some of the techniques David described, including baiting counter-protesters, was exactly what he and his friends were doing in the 1980s and 1990s. They would try to attract violence and then very enthusiastically respond to anybody who was trying to fight back. So thank you so much for joining us, Tony, and thank you for the work that you're doing. So David, despite all of these efforts to conceal their mission, Samantha Froelich also described Identity Europa as a violent neo-Nazi organization in her testimony. Can you share how this underlying Nazi ideology and beliefs really motivated the members of Identity Europa?
Sure, and I would say Identity Europa is one example of several large anti-Semitic and white supremacist organizations that are similar and use similar techniques. They're very careful, at least Identity Europa was very careful to portray itself in this sanitized version that Ms. Froelich described to the public. But she testified that in private gatherings, the members of the group would let their guard down and they would openly share their Nazi beliefs with one another. And they were very much inspired by Hitler and Nazism specifically. And they wanted to coordinate and execute a long-term plan that would spark what they called a racial holy war, or RAHOWA, in order to create a white ethno-state. One approach that Ms. Froelich described would involve escalating violence over the course of time, physical violent confrontations between white people and every other race, where only white people would survive these confrontations. It seemed that this would be accomplished through a series of escalating violent confrontations like Charlottesville that eventually would lead to normalizing the concept of violence, normalizing hate speech against non-European white people, and the white ethno-state itself, which seems to have various iterations, but the most common I heard about during trial preparation was a state that would be organized and run by and for white people, where non-whites could potentially live, but would not have the same rights as the white people of European descent.
Let's hear directly from Froelich again, as she describes how her group and others like it justified using any means necessary to try to achieve their goals.
To be pro-white, you are anti-everything else. There's this narrative in the alt-right that you're a victim, that you're being beaten down and browbeaten for just existing and all of these things. And the belief is that white people need to fight back. The belief is that white people need to take care of themselves and be ready for this war that everyone thinks is going to happen. I mean, it's just inherently violent. To think that people are subhuman means that it wouldn't be murder if you killed them because they're not even human. That's violent.
And unfortunately, it seems like there are some white supremacists who have taken on violence. And Edna, in the 5 years since the deadly Unite the Right rally, many of us are still obviously quite disturbed when we see white supremacist symbols out in the open or hear of violence that's motivated by these racist conspiracy theories. But many of us aren't that surprised anymore. Can you remind us of some of the events that have happened over the past 5 years that have been fueled by white supremacy?
So this mindset and this deliberate provocation of violence is nothing new. It just seems to be more out in the open and brazen in the last several years. I do want to note that we keep talking about white supremacists, but that anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews, is at its core. So one former white supremacist that I talked to, or white nationalist, as they sometimes call themselves, told me that without hatred of Jews, there would be no movement. And we can see that, for example, in an attack that took place a little more than a year after the Charlottesville events, this time in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, when on a Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath, a man armed with a semi-automatic weapon attacked the Tree of Life synagogue, and he murdered 11 congregants in their sanctuary of prayer and wounded 6 others, including 4 policemen. This killer later told police that Jews were, and I quote him, committing genocide against his people. So a direct invocation of the kind of replacement paranoia that I described earlier. This particular murderer had heard about an American Jewish social service organization that was helping immigrants to integrate and to settle into new homes. And he said that they were helping people who were invaders. We mentioned earlier about the killer in Buffalo, or the alleged killer in Buffalo, who was also motivated by similar ideas. But let's be clear, these are not ideas or crimes that are confined to lone actors. During the attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, 2021, many of these same symbols and ideologies were on full display, as we see here in this man wearing a Camp Auschwitz sweatshirt, clearly a Holocaust denier and someone inspired by Nazi Germany. You know, this was not everyone who was present on January 6th, but they felt comfortable there, people who held that idea and were emboldened to agitate and become destructive and violent at the seat of American democracy. So people are less shy. Things that may have previously existed in the shadows of society are now really out in the open and emboldened. What is most troubling to me, secondary, of course, to deadly violence, though, is the way that it's being legitimized by some political candidates and even elected officials at both the state and national level, who are appearing at conferences, formally showing themselves willing to share a stage with groups like these at events, and having no shame to be associated with their voices. So this is a slow, very strategic, deliberate mainstreaming and normalization of groups who glorify the Nazi genocide against the Jews and are proudly and unapologetically portraying themselves as the inheritors of that history.
Yeah, that's a really important point. I used to think maybe I was being naive, but I used to think that there was this universal agreement that yes, anti-Semitism is a massive problem. That's something that we need to focus on. But at least everybody kind of agreed that the Holocaust was wrong, that genocide was wrong. And so the mainstreaming of some of these organizations that are glorifying the Nazis and glorifying the Holocaust are just terrifying, and something that I, at least when I was becoming a historian, was not necessarily prepared to deal with. We have a question from a viewer named Eric that I think makes a lot of sense to stick here. He's saying that versions of replacement theory and whitewashing of US history are seen in political movements today. And how do we recommend teaching against that ideology? Edna, I know this is something that you give a lot of thought about. What advice do you have for any teachers who might be out there?
So I would say, start with the kind of pull back of the curtain that we're doing here today. Encourage students to not be suckers for the propaganda. I'm a mom of teenagers. I know there's nothing that they like less than being tricked or duped. Help them to recognize when there are these symbols, what they really mean, what this seemingly maybe appealing language or kind of neutral language is actually camouflaging. What is it hiding? And most people are not extremists. Most people are not violent racists. You have to be taught to be that as well, and that they aren't seduced by the facade that's being presented, but to see what really its true aims are and not to be confused. That's where I would start.
Yeah, I would also, there was a Facebook Live program that you hosted back in January 2021 about the need and the narrative and the network that is fueling people who are inclined to join those groups. And I have gone back to that program multiple times just to educate myself when these kinds of questions come up. Why are people making the choices that they're making? So I would also advise going back and watching that program if that's a question that you have. Obviously these acts of violence are continuing. Just a few months ago, police interrupted what could have been a very violent clash that was organized by white supremacists in Idaho. Edna, one more question for you. Can you tell us a little bit about the group that was allegedly behind that planned riot?
Sure. So in this case, the target or the goal was to provoke violence around a gay pride parade taking place in the state of Idaho. Thanks to good police work and alert surveillance, they discovered a group of men dressed in a slightly different uniform this time, navy polos and khaki pants. They discovered them inside a rented truck, again, carrying what we now recognize as kind of telltale shields and other types of riot gear. And eventually, prosecutors charged more than 30 of these men with conspiracy to riot. Many of them were wearing hats with a logo associated with a group called the Patriot Front, which is another one of these white supremacist racist groups affiliated with some of the planners of the Charlottesville rally. While we cannot be sure exactly what they had planned, its online propaganda, the group's online propaganda, is not subtle at all. It includes the phrase, "embrace violence." So this is one case where thankfully law enforcement was able to disrupt their plans, but it's something that is seething, that's simmering below the surface and is dangerous.
Well, and David, at the trial, you represented several individuals who were injured by James Fields when he intentionally drove his car into the crowd. He was not a leader in any of these movements. He was one of the foot soldiers. He was a follower. What did you find out about him that made him susceptible to carrying out such a violent act?
That's a good question, and goes to a lot of what Edna was talking about, which is when people don't have alternatives, healthy alternatives, they turn to groups like this to find meaning and association. James Fields was a true believer. He went to Charlottesville convinced he was contributing to a vital cause for his race. He understood that that necessarily included violence. That was a critical component, and we saw that in his own tweets and other social media postings. He was a dedicated adherent to Hitler and Nazism. We showed this photo from his bedroom at the trial, which is quite haunting. It was a shrine to Hitler and Nazism. And you may not be able to see it from this photo, but he also had a Nazi flag on his wall. He committed crimes, obviously, and was tried as an individual for murder and attempted murder. He was sentenced to more than 400 years in prison, but he was not a lone actor. That was part of the challenge of our trial, was to show that the organizers of Charlottesville conspired to ensure that the participants in their event were focused on a common enemy and that the outcome was violence. They were trying to recruit others who would help carry out that violence. And you know, James Fields was exactly the kind of person they were looking for. The fact that he drove into a crowd of what was obviously counter-protesters based on what they were wearing and the signs that they were carrying, the fact that he drove into that crowd that particular weekend was not a coincidence. This was his contribution to the common goal of the conspiracy. And at the end of the trial, the jury agreed with that and found that the leaders and James Fields all participated together, along with some other foot soldiers, in a conspiracy to intimidate and harass based on race and ethnicity. And they awarded more than $26 million in damages, which I guess is a ray of hope. What in my view, what happened in Charlottesville is, as Edna has really superbly described, is really a new version of a very old story. There are modern tools to spread this propaganda and to recruit new soldiers, but the symbols and messages are taken, seems to me, directly from an 80-year-old playbook.
So David, I have one more question for you. It's a question from a viewer named Steven. And I'm kind of asking you this as a lawyer and as someone who participated in the Unite the Right trial, has thought about these big questions a lot. Stephen would like to know, what is the line between free speech and hate speech in the United States? And what have you learned in terms of what can be done to counteract these hateful and dangerous ideas and to reduce and eliminate the threat that they pose in our society? It's a big question.
That is a big question. It's a great question, Stephen, and it's been much litigated, and it's a big fundamental part of our country and our constitutional system. The more tolerance you have, the more hateful speech you have to tolerate, and we all know that. The clear line, is certainly in this case, was violence, inciting people to violence, encouraging violence, actually engaging in violence is where that line is clearly crossed. And I think we do need to be, my personal view is that it's correct to have a system that tolerates hateful speech. I think it's critical that we do that, lest we find ourselves unable to speak against people that we think are completely wrong in their views and beliefs. So here, in our case, the defendants actually did try to get the case dismissed on First Amendment grounds and defended what they were doing as political rallying and free speech. And the judge rejected that correctly, in my view, because what they were really doing was conspiring to commit violence based on race and ethnicity.
I really want to thank you both. Edna, you have helped us understand the long history of these symbols and these conspiracies, and it is so important to recognize them for what they are. They are symbols and expressions of hate and violence. So thank you so much for lending your expertise to us today.
Happy to change chairs.
And David, I mean, thank you first for sharing your insights about the inner workings of the dangerous conspiracy, but also we're really grateful to you and to the other lawyers for actually holding the white supremacist planners accountable and for offering a measure of justice to the victims. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
The images and video we saw today still have the power to shock, and that is a good thing. When we look away, when we stop thinking and feeling, that is when those who are seeking to mainstream violence and hatred succeed. At our museum, we often remind people that the Holocaust did not begin with killing. It began with words. And as we've seen, and as Edna described, in the 5 years since Charlottesville, dangerous conspiracies can quickly escalate from words into violence. And it is incumbent upon all of us to remain vigilant, to equip ourselves with knowledge, and to stand against hatred and anti-Semitism wherever we see it. Thank you so much for joining us today.